Hello and welcome. We're going to go over a few things. We're going to go over how to actually upload a file with Laravel. We're going to learn how to iterate over a CSV file. This CSV file will have about 200,000 records. We'll talk about how we can import decently large files without using a lot of memory. And then we'll go ahead and we'll style the records that we actually import and we'll display them out on the screen. All right, let's go ahead and get started. What I have here is a blank Laravel project. This project, I've only updated the README. I just deleted the default text that was in the README. And I also installed a package called IDE Helper. This helps autocomplete some of the features of Laravel within my IDE editor. Let's take a look at what the project currently looks like in the internet browser. It's just the default Laravel install. You can see I'm refreshing here. This is what we get when we install Laravel. First things first, let's go to the routes file so we can take a look at updating that. So again, we've just got the default. So we've got a welcome. So let's go ahead and change where this points to. We're going to create our own view file here. This lives in the resources, views, and we can see our welcome. But we're going to go ahead and create our own. We're just going to name it transactions. We're going to be importing transactions, a large CSV of transactions. Okay, so we need our doc type. I'm really going to try and show you guys like from start to beginning how to do everything so that there's nothing's left out so you can really see the entire process. Forgot the HTML tag up here. Okay. So let's go back to our route file and let's change this to transactions. That's the name of the file. So the view is just correlating to the name of the file here, minus the blade.php. Laravel automatically knows. Transactions here is the transactions.blade.php. Let's go ahead and check our browser to see what we get. Okay, great. We get a blank page. So let's go ahead and update this blank page. Let's give it an h1 tag. We're going to do transactions import. Make sure this is showing up that we get everything. Great. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create a form. This form is going to post to itself, so we don't actually have to do an action. We can just do method post. And since we're going to be uploading a file, we've got to do enc type, and we're going to do multi-part form data. We're going to go ahead and create a new input file. And we're going to name this CSV file. Let's give this a label. And then let's give this an ID so that the for on the label has something to attach to. All right, let's see what we've got here. Okay, great. We've got the label and then we've got the input file, but let's add a break here so that it a little bit better. All right, so now, once we have these two, we have to be able to submit the form. So we got to add a button, type of submit. Let's double check that we've got this going. And we'll notice that the upload button is also on the same. So we're going to add a couple breaks here. Let's see what one looks like. Let's add another break to give it some separation. We're going to add some styling later. but I want to show the functionality first. So we've got our h1 tag that's describing the page, we've got our file input, and then we've got our upload. Now as it stands right now, it's going to post to itself. So it's going to post on this same URL back to itself. Now in order for that to work, we actually need to create that route. Let's see what happens right now if we just try to upload our transactions file without that route existing. So there's my transactions.csv. If I click upload, we're going to get an error because the post method doesn't exist. So going back to the web. So we see that we've got a route here. Since we're doing a post on this route post, and we're going to use the same route. And let's see what we get if we dump the entire request. One way we can dump the entire request is if we do request all. I think the results might surprise you if you're not familiar with uploading files in Laravel. So I'm just going to go ahead and refresh this page again. It's going to go ahead and try and submit this form. Aha. So this page expired means that we're missing a key component on our form. In Laravel, there's something called a CSRF token. This token helps secure your form, and Laravel requires it by default. So what this is going to do is it's going to put a hidden input element on the form page. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. So if we inspect this, we can see here that there's input type hidden with a token. What happens is when we submit the form, this token's also submitted, and Laravel looks for this token to make sure that the form hasn't been tampered with. Okay, so now that we've added the CSRF token, we can actually submit the form. So let's go ahead and try that now. Again, I think the results are going to surprise you. So when we click upload, we've got two things. We've got the token, and then we've also got the CSV file. And notice the CSV file doesn't exactly contain what you think it contains. It actually contains details about the file, and somewhere in here, if we want to read it, we'd actually have to get the contents of the file. So one thing that we're going to note here is this real path, and we're going to use that in a little bit. So let's take a look at how we can use that. So if we want to get the contents of the file, what we can do is we can do request file. Laravel has a function if you want to grab a file, and then you can give it the name. So ours was CSV file, and then we can do get. And what get is going to do, it's going to get the contents of the file as a string. So this is going to return everything. And this is what our file looks like. It's got a description, it's got the amount, it's got the date, the card type, and the last four. Now I just generated fake data here, and these are just just fake sentences here. But all in all, we have about 200,000 lines. So it's a pretty sizable import here. Let's take a look at what happens when we dump the file. Here's my CSV. I'm going to click upload. And as you could imagine, Laravel is now showing the actual contents of the file. Now this is important because this is what we're going to use with the CSV reader to actually get the contents and then process them. So let's go into how we're going to process the CSV and the package that we're going to use in order to process it. I personally have used in the past a package by the PHP League. It's called CSV, and it's a good package if you want to import CSVs. I'm going to go ahead and stop this because the file is so large. So let's look this package up. Typed in PHP League CSV. It's the first hit. And if you want to install this package, we can just go here. So let's go ahead and install this package. Now that the package is installed, we can now use it. And they've got some pretty good documentation here for going through it. This is just kind of the getting started, but they also have some good docs if you go to documentation. But for our purposes, it's only a few lines of code to actually get what we're going to do. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we've got here. So one more important thing that I want to outline is I'm going to do this again. So remember this real path. This real path is going to be the path to the temporary file that Laravel is saying that this is where the uploaded file is. So sometimes in Laravel, you might want to actually keep the file that's uploaded. In other cases, you may not. So if you do want to keep it, you'd have to do arrow move. But in our case, we don't really care to keep the uploaded file. We just need it temporarily in order to process our records. Let's take a look at what it looks like to process those records. So we've installed our package. Everything's good to go. So what we're going to do now is we're going to actually take a look at what it looks like to start processing it. So we need a reader. Reader is a class by League CSV. And we're going to create it from path. So that path that we see here is what we're going to give the CSV reader. So we can do request, file, CSV file, real path. And that tells League, the CSV reader, to grab this file, and now we're going to use it. Next, we're going to tell the CSV reader that it has a header, and that header is going to be the first row. This is going to be important. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So DD is going to be our friend along the way here. So we can do CSV get header. Let's start with a blank page. Import our CSV, click upload. Notice here, it returned us an array with the description, with the columns that are at the top of our CSV here: description, amount, date, card type, last four. This is going to make working with our data so much easier because you don't have to remember which position stuff is in. So now that we know that we can get the header, let's take a look at actually start processing the records. So in order to start processing the records, there's a couple ways that you can do it with the League CSV package. If we look at their documentation, they give one right out of the box, which is getting the records. Now what this is going to do is this is going to get all of the records for the entire CSV, which for sometimes it might work, sometimes it may not work. If you want to be the most memory efficient, this is not the way to go. So what we can actually do is when you get the CSV, when you get the object back from the create path, we can actually just do a for each on the CSV variable itself. So if we go for each on a CSV record and we DD the record, let's see what happens. Blank page. Let's go ahead and give it the file and click upload. All right, great. So we've got our first row. This is our first row. And the nice thing about this is that the CSV package is only loading one row at a time, which is going to be the biggest benefit for us when we're importing 200,000 records. Because depending on your servers, those 200,000 records may eat up a considerable amount of memory and other resources. So since we now can start importing the records, we are going to need a table to house this data. So let's go ahead and create the migration. So Laravel has a bunch of commands to create all different types of file. This is just the command to create a migration. Okay, so depending on the syntax that you use when you're making your migration, Laravel can actually automatically figure out what it is that you're trying to do. Because I have create in the beginning and I think table at the end, it knows that we're going to create a transactions table. Laravel automatically put a schema create in the migration file. So what we're most concerned about is the part in between. So we know based on our file that we're going to need a description. Let's take a look at what other fields we've got. We've got the amount, the date, the card type, and last four. So let's do amount. Some people will decide to store their amounts or their money amounts as decimals. Some will store them as integers. Some will store them as strings. You really have to take into consideration what it is that you're trying to do. I know because I've got this test data that this will always, I can always handle a decimal amount and that this may always be, let's say, in USD. If that's not the case, you might want to store everything in pennies so that things can be easily converted. I also know that the total digits aren't going to be more than 8 and that we only need 2 decimal points after the decimal. Now, again, depending on the currency, these things change, but for our purposes, this is what I'm going to use. Got a transaction date, so that's going to be a date time. We've got the card brand. And then we've got the last four of the card. So this is what our transaction table is going to look like. So we've got our table. One thing that we'll have to double check is in our EMV to make sure that we've got the database stuff set up correctly. So I already went ahead prior to this and I created a database called transaction import, and I already had everything like the database created, so I knew I could put this in there. Let's go ahead and migrate the database. Now there is an extra bunch of stuff here. This is default Laravel stuff: create users, create password, failed jobs, personal access tokens. This is all default Laravel stuff. The thing that we're really concerned about here is the create transactions table. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at the transactions table. So as you can see, I am logged in to my database and we've got these tables here. So here's our transactions table. There's nothing in here at the moment, but let's go ahead and start populating some of this data. So I'm going to go back to our web. Okay, so in order to do that, we're also going to need a model, and that model is we're going to call it transaction so that we're following the Laravel way of doing things. So we're going to use another make command. And we're going to call it transaction. So Laravel has a system that the table name should be plural and the model should be singular. This model is going to be created. Okay, let's take a look at the model that was just created. Okay, as we can see, we've got this model here, and this is all that it has, which is good for us. Back to the function. So we can start inserting records and creating records in here now that we've got our records. So in order to insert a record with the model, we can just do transaction, which is the model, and then we can do create. And this allows us to just create a single record. So we've got a description. And if we look at our data here, remember this is the first row. So if we want to access the record, we just do record with a description as the key. So record, description. We also have amount. And for this one, we're going to use a function called float val. We want to actually convert, because everything in the CSV will be a string, we're going to convert that string into a float. Because our database is expecting the decimal. Let's take a look at what else we have. We've got the date. So we're going to use a PHP library called Carbon. And we're going to use a function that they have called parse, which knows common formats of dates and will actually just turn it into a date for us. So we know that this is going to be record date. Next is going to be card brand. This card type. And then last four. So before we do this, we actually have to tell Laravel that transaction date is a date. So that way it knows how to convert this date object into a MySQL date time like record. So let's go here. And what we can do is we can say casts. And in these casts, Laravel allows us to, when we set a value or a property on this model, it's going to convert basically like whatever type that we say it should cast to. So if we're telling it should cast a string to a date, it will. So anytime we access this property, we know that we'll be getting a date. So we just have to tell Laravel that this is a date time. So every time we get the transaction date or setting it, it's going to automatically try and convert it to a Carbon object for us. Okay, so now that we're actually creating the record, let's create one record and then just DD, stop the execution, DD it, and then take a look at that something actually inserted into the database. Okay, so this is Laravel telling us that we're actually not able to mass assign these properties. So we have to tell Laravel that it's okay for us to mass assign these properties. Laravel has a feature where it'll prevent you from doing that in that sometimes people don't want to be able to do this for security reasons. So we're going to tell Laravel that we can fill all properties all the time. So let's try again. Okay, we should have one record in our database. So I go and refresh. We've got the record. Okay, let's take a look at the web PHP. Let's actually just try and let's see what happens if we import 500 records. So we're going to add just a simple counter here. All right, so every time we create a record, we're going to count, and then once we reach 500, we're going to say 500 records imported. Okay, let's get rid of this one record that's in the database. You can see that we've got no records in the database. Let's go to a blank page, put our CSV in here, and then click upload. And we can see that takes maybe a second or two for it to import. Not bad. Check the database. Okay, looks like we've got quite a bit of records here. Let's write a query here to view how many records we have. So select count star from transactions. Okay, we can see that we've got 500 records in our transactions table. All right, let's up this to, let's try 10,000 records. Let's truncate everything in our database. Start with a fresh table. Come back here. Blank page. Let's go ahead and grab our CSV and upload the file again. All right, so we can see that it's taking a little bit longer. We're at about 5 seconds, about 10 seconds, 15 seconds. So what we can see here is that it's taking a considerable amount of time now. And this is really because for every time that we are running through each record, we're actually running a query. So we're going to show that we can just insert multiple records in a single query, which will be much faster. So we've got 10,000 records imported. Let's refresh the table. Okay, we can see that we got a bunch of records here, but let's actually do the count. And we can see that we now have 10,000 records. So this isn't very performant, and the app that we have isn't very large either. So, as your app grows, things will probably slow down a little bit. So let's take a look at how we can import this in maybe a more efficient way. So what we're going to do here is there's a function called insert that expects an array of arrays. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a transactions array. And we're going to add each transaction record into here. We're going to take this and we're going to put it on to the transactions array. So it's going to be an array of these. And then in this insert, we're just going to tell it to insert the transactions. So it's going to go through each record in the array and then insert the record. So we don't need this count anymore because we can just count the array. So what we're going to do is for every, let's say 5,000, let's start with actually 1,000. For every 1,000 records, so when there's 1,000 records in the transactions array, we're gonna stop and just make sure that everything inserted correctly. Let's see if this works as we expect it, but let's start with a fresh database. Okay, the transactions have been deleted. Let's get a fresh page. Grab our CSV and then upload. Okay, this is taking a lot longer than expected. Let's see what's going on. Okay, so what we should be doing is we're going to add this to the array, but only when there's 1,000 in there, we want to insert the records. So basically we're still doing, because we had the insert outside of this, we were still inserting every, for every record, we were still doing a 1-to-1 instead of inserting 1,000 records at a time. So let's take a look at the database. There's going to be records in there because it was running. Let's get a fresh database. Re-import the CSV, click upload, and you can see, so we imported 1,000 records that quickly, probably less than a second. Let's double check to make sure that everything was imported successfully. Refresh. Let's check how many we have here. Okay, we do have 1,000. But one thing that I do want to note is that the created at and the updated at fields are now null. And that's because when we use the insert method in Laravel, the model events aren't being fired. So we, on the transaction, we extend the model, and that model has timestamps trait, and that trait is the thing that handles automatically adding a created at and updated at timestamp. And so since we're not running through that with a create, we're just we're doing the insert where the events aren't necessarily firing. We need to actually add that ourselves. So we're going to do created at. And now is a special function that Laravel has that just gets the current date time with a carbon date time object. And we're going to do updated at with the same thing. So let's go ahead and try this to make sure that our data is correct. Okay, so let's upload this CSV. We should get 1,000 records again. Let's make sure that we've got, okay, so we do have stuff inside created at and updated at, which is what we'd expect. And we're also importing 1,000 records at a time. Let's take a look at what it might look like to import 5,000 records at one time. Okay, let's try 5,000 at one time. Okay, you can see how quick that is. That's still very quick, even though it's 5,000 records. Got a bunch of records here. Let's double check that we have 5,000. Okay, so we do have 5,000. The count says we have 5,000. Let's go ahead and import all of the records. Let's see what it takes to import all 200,000 records, inserting 5,000 records at a time. Now, in order to do this, we want to, every 5,000 records, we want to actually set the transactions array back to blank. So that way the count restarts. And so then after it finishes all the records, we're going to do a DD saying all records were imported successfully. And grab our CSV. Okay, so sometimes this may happen. This is probably because we're running out of memory. So Laravel is also running in the background when you are running these queries. They're keeping track of the queries. And sometimes what happens is it'll actually eat up some of your memory because it's keeping track of some of those queries in the background. So what we're actually going to do is we're actually going to grab a little script or like a couple methods to disable the remembering of those. So we're going to put it up here at the top. This is just telling that to not use to unset the event dispatcher and disable query log, again, because they're keeping track of the queries that are running. So if we look in our database, some records were actually imported. It looks like we made it through 20,000 records before before it stopped. So let's go ahead and clear out the database. Start fresh. Let's grab our CSV and let's go ahead and upload. So we're at about 10 seconds right now. Okay, looks like everything imported in about 15 or so seconds, all 200,000 records. So let's go ahead, take a look at the database. We've got records here, so that's good. Let's see how many records we have. All right, we have 200,000 records. So all 200,000 records were imported that quickly, 5,000 at a time. So this is going to be the real big benefit of reading each line of the CSV individually and then doing what you want to do with it. And so we're choosing just to add it to an array and then inserting it. All right, so let's take a look at perhaps what it might look like if we were to actually, redirect the user back to the page and also maybe display those transactions. Maybe it's a transactions page and they want to import records and they want to see those records that were imported. They just want to see all the transactions in general that they have. So one thing that we can do here is we can actually redirect back to the page that it was originally on. So let's go ahead and redirect ourselves back. So what's going to do is going to redirect us back to this get route that actually that we had before. Let's start it. Okay, so all the transactions were imported, and you notice it brought us back to the same page that we were at when we actually uploaded. And notice how it says no files. It says no file chosen. It's important because we know that we now have a fresh page, was because when I put the transactions.csv there, it showed that that file was going to be uploaded. So if we could take this one step further and actually we can say with, let's give it a key of success. So what this is going to do is going to put flash data in the session, and then we can say all transactions imported. So when we redirect back to this route, it's going to put something in the session that we can then grab to use to then display to the user. So let's look at our transactions. And between transactions import and the form, let's make sure that if that success is in the session, let's display this. So what we can do is if session success, oh, we can actually just do this. So if the session success has something in it, display what's in it. Let's go ahead and try this again. Okay, so notice that I've got the transactions.csv here. I'm going to click upload. It's going to take a bit for it to actually upload. Okay, the page redirected back and we've got the all transactions imported text here. Now this flash message only lives one time. So if I refresh the page here, notice how it's gone. So that's important because it's just a little tweak that can give like the user experience just a little bit more. And we will take the time to format and style this a little bit better here. Okay, so let's see Let's add the transactions actually to this table too, because they probably want to see what transactions are in here. So if we want to put the transactions in here, we actually have to pass them in too. So the way that we can pass them in is just like any other thing when you're working with Laravel, you can pass into the view. So we're going to say transactions. We're going to use the transactions model, and we're actually going to call paginate. So paginate is a function that you can use to paginate the results of whatever it is that you're doing. So for us, we're paginating all of the records in the transactions table, but you could write your own query and then call paginate on it. All right, so now we have the transaction. The transactions variable is available to us in our view file. So let's go ahead and let's build a table. Let's see if this data actually appears on the page for us. So since we already have stuff in the database, this should actually just appear already. Okay, great. And notice how we're not actually displaying all of the records because we're calling paginate. And paginate's only getting the first 15, I believe, 15 or 25 records. So this is why we've got just a limited set of data here. So it looks like kind of our table is a little close to the import. So let's give it maybe some space. For now, we're just going to use break tags. We're going to come back and let's maybe put an HR here. We're going to come back to this, make it a little bit better here. Okay, cool. So we've got our table and it's got our data in it. Laravel also actually has a special function that when you call paginate and you're sending it to the view, we can call transactions links. And what that's going to do is give us links to actually go to different pages of our data. And it actually formats them and has default styles. So if you're using Tailwind, I think Tailwind's the default style. It will actually style the previous, next, and everything. If you've got Tailwind, I think they also have Bootstrap. You just have to tell it in your app service provider somewhere that you're using Bootstrap and not Tailwind. They may have others. So if I click next here, we can see that it's actually updating the data, and Laravel does this automatically for us. Okay, great. So now that we've got this, let's take a look at maybe styling this a little bit so that it looks a little bit better. So when somebody's coming to our transactions import page in our app, they're gonna want to have something that looks semi nice for them to kind of come to. So I have some of these already prepared. Because there can be a lot of typing. I'm going to use Tailwind. So take a look at what it looks like to use Tailwind within our Laravel app here. And I'm just going to use Tailwind CSS. The Tailwind install was skipped, but their docs outline installing it well. So now that we've added Tailwind, you can notice that quite a bit actually changed. We've got the text actually got a little larger. And remember when I was talking about the links at the bottom, how they're automatically formatted if you're using Tailwind? Well, we've now got the default styles. Notice the H1 that we had up here is no longer large. So we're going to have to take care of all the styling for this. So first, let's start with the H1. There's a class called text3xl, and that's going to tell the Tailwind to use this class, and then that class is going to tell it to make the font larger. Let's refresh the page. Okay, great. Let's also add margin bottom to this because we don't want the form to be right on top of it. Okay, great. Let's actually move it down just a little bit more. Okay, so now let's work on styling the file input. Now, styling file inputs aren't exactly the easiest thing to do. You can add some stuff here, but then you're also going to have to add like some special like pseudo class names in the CSS. So I have some some styles that I've already used in the past that I'm just going to grab and then use that. Got this. So let's take a look at this. Refresh this. So we can see that it changed a little bit. It's not quite what we'd expect. All right, I think we can do a little bit better than this. I have some pre-copied CSS that we're going to put in our app CSS. And then because we actually added some CSS to this app CSS, we have to run the npm run dev again so that it regenerates our CSS file. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's refresh this. So now we can see that it's styled a little bit nicely, a little bit nicer here. And this is our submit button. So let's take a look at perhaps styling our submit button a little bit better than this. Okay, so Tailwind gives us a bunch of classes that we can use to style stuff. So we're gonna do class. It's gonna be rounded. We want to give it a BG gray 700, let's say. And let's start with this. Okay, notice how it's hard to read. The text is black. We maybe need to add some margin between the two and then also some padding on the button so that the upload, you can see that and read the upload better. So we're going to add text white. We're going to add padding on left and right. We're going to do, on each side, we're going to do 3. And then top to bottom, we're going to do 1. Let's take a look at how this looks. Okay, a little bit better. Let's add a margin top to this so that it separates itself. Okay, I think that looks a lot better. What we're going to do is we're actually going to surround the entire body to get this stuff. We're going to get this away from the edges just a little bit. So I realize now that I actually had the body tag in the wrong spot. All right, so this should be better. We're going to take all of this and put it inside the div tag. Now with that div tag, we're just going to give it a max width of 6XL and let's see what happens. Okay, so it appears that nothing happens, but if we do this, let's give it some padding on the left and the right, let's say 6. And then let's say we want this in the center, left and right centered. Okay, so if we make this a little bigger, we can see that it's now center. Couldn't see it before because my window was too small. All right, so now we've got some decent styling started here. Let's go ahead and maybe perhaps let's take away some of these break tags because we can solve some of these break tags with some margins. Let's see what this looks like. Yeah, the HR is literally on top of the upload button. Let's add a margin on the HR. And let's add a margin top to bottom on both so that the HR is kind of in the middle. All right, cool. So now we've got the trans H1, we've got the file input, we've got a little bit of separation here, and then we've got the actual table. So if we click any one of these, it's going to go to that page and actually update the data all the way to page 4000. So this is really some of the power of Laravel. Let's get these links maybe a little further away from the table. So we're going to wrap a div around this. We're going to a margin top of 6. Let's see how far this pushes it away. Okay, I think that looks good. Let's go ahead and make sure that everything's working, even though all we did was kind of move some HTML around and add some styling. Let's make sure that everything is still working. So I'm actually going to clear out the database. Let's get a fresh page. Got a fresh page. Notice how, we have nothing here in the transactions table, so it's not actually displaying anything. We could make this one step better and say no transactions or something, but we're just going to leave it for now. So I've got my transactions file. This appears to still be working properly. Let's click upload. Okay, so it redirected us. The file was imported. We've got 200,000 results. And look at this, we still have our session message, our Flask message that was added, after all the transactions were imported. Let's actually go ahead and take a look at how we can style this a little bit better because this isn't very noticeable if you're looking at the page. So what we can do here, let's add some classes. Let's say because it's a success message, we want to make it green. So we can say we're going to do green, say 300. Let's give it some padding on the left and the right. So let's do PX3. Let's give it some padding on the top and the bottom. Do PY1. Let's say we want rounded corners. And then we want the text to be, let's see what the text white looks like. Let's go ahead and import another file. Click upload. Okay, so the green looks a little bit bright. It's a little harder to read the text there. So let's go ahead and let's make this a little bit darker. One other thing that we can do is perhaps put some margin in between the success message and then the label. So let's go ahead and do a margin bottom and let's do 7. Okay, let's try this again. We're going to click upload. Okay, great. So we've got a darker success message. The success message is a little further from the form itself. And I think this is looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and refresh the page and make sure that the session message goes away. Okay, it looks like it does. So, I think there's a lot more work that we could do here, and I think this would never be done if we wanted to make this perfect. But what we were able to accomplish is import a sizable CSV file, process that in a memory efficient way, style it, show the results in about an hour. So the beautiful thing about Laravel and Tailwind and all these things combined is that this stuff really makes development and the development experience like super awesome. If you guys have any questions, put some comments below. Like, comment, subscribe, and I'm happy to continue doing these videos. I have a lot more in store, and I hope that you guys will join me for the rest.